What's going on, everyone? This is Greg with SportsRehabExpert.com. Today we're going to be covering the recent injury to Sterling Shepard and his torn ACL. May have happened even though it seemed like a fluke injury. I think there's contributing factors to this that aren't so fluky. But the other factor we're going to be talking about today is how the turf could be impacting injury rates in sports, not just football. Any other sports such as soccer or sports that use the synthetic turf fields. Are these turf fields increasing risk for injury? Research has continually shown that friction, the amount of friction created on these type of synthetic turf fields is a much higher grade than what is typically found on just normalized grass. But just to illustrate my point of how this increased traction could potentially have negative biomechanic effects. So when you look at this particular synthetic turf, it's the bottom video here. They use what's the 𝐴𝐻 version. It's the synthetic tires and the black stuff that you see popping up when athletes change the direction. When you look at a ball strike the ground, so you can see the ball has some backspin. The soccer ball has some backspin coming into it. When it strikes the ground, it reverses its pivot. It starts spinning in the opposite direction. That's the amount of traction and grip that the synthetic turf possesses, that it's able to change the spin on the ball on contact. Think about how that's going to influence somebody's joint mechanics when they contact the ground with a ton amount of force versus the above, which is again a different synthetic turf, but it does not create that same sort of reversal of spin. The ball just slows its spin, its backspin down. So in my opinion, that would mean that this top turf would be the more advantageous of the two. Now, I think it's important to look at all these factors, look at it from a synthetic turf standpoint, but then also compare it to both natural grass on natural sod, but then also those rollout sod. Again, I don't know the name and the terminology of that, but I think it's important that this should all be compared and all be considered when you're talking about which fields would be most advantageous for athletes to play on. When you factor into the component of this is the technology of cleat and footwear is getting more and more advanced as well too. You don't see people changing out their cleats anymore when you're watching a football game. That's because they found a turf that has a high amount of friction and a cleat that creates a high amount of traction. When you combine the two together, there's a lot of force that is being capable of being put into the ground. So this is the first question that you need to ask yourself when you're considering turf, and if we should get away with all this synthetic turf that is currently out there and just go back to grass. Are you willing to see athletes slip more on the field? Are you willing to see a sloppier game? You don't see athletes slip as much as they used to. It still happens, but it's not going to happen nearly as often, especially when we're talking about the field being wet in those outdoor stadiums. Now I want to go back and get into Sterling Shepard's injury and talk about some of the factors of why I think this happened. This is the problem, one of the many problems that synthetic turf has created with their increased friction, is that it allows you to get away with sloppy mechanics. If we look at the picture of when the initial contact, ACL injuries happen at a split millisecond of time. So we need to look at the initial impact of the landing. If we look at that initial impact, freeze frame it, what we see is the foot clear out in front of the body, landing directly on the back edge of the heel, and we see the torso leaning backwards. If you were to try to stop this way on grass in flat shoes with no cleats, you would slip. If you throw a wet field into the mixture, you would land up on your ass trying to stop this way. This is not an efficient mechanic to try to stop, but when you have a high amount of friction, being increased friction from the turf, increased traction from the cleat, it allows you to stop in these awkward angles that aren't efficient from a mechanical standpoint. What these positions do is put an extraordinary amount of focal pressure into specific areas, and that's why you see injuries occur, especially the non-contact versions. High amount of force in a short period of time in a disadvantageous position. So one of the reasons why grass would help is that it's going to be a fail-safe mechanism for people to train on, because you're either going to slip. I'd rather have a pulled muscle from slipping on the field as opposed to a torn ACL. Night and day. Very easy decision right there. But secondly, because you're playing on that grass surface day in and day out, you're not going to learn these disadvantageous positions to put your body into. You're going to have to use the position that your body is going to have to adapt to so that you do not slip, which means you're either going to slip or use a more efficient pattern. If you slip enough, you're going to learn a different way of doing something so that you do not slip, and that is likely going to be a more efficient pattern. Here on the turf, you can get away with poor mechanics because the amount of friction allows you to do so. Do this day in and day out, the athlete isn't going to recognize that this is a disadvantageous position until eventually a fluke injury such as this happens. Now finally, and perhaps the biggest factor of why this injury occurred, is we need to consider that he was just coming off an Achilles injury. Achilles rupture, Achilles repair. So it may not seem like a big difference, especially since the athlete was moving slow. We take a similar picture of an athlete moving a lot faster, Michael Jordan here coming for his free throw line dunk, to transition horizontal momentum vertically as he takes off for a jump. You can see that the angle of the torso is much more upright, but then also there's a deeper knee bend as well as a deeper hip bend that occurs, so there's not a straight line running from the shoulder down to the knee. The straighter the line, the more force you're going to see happen right up at the knee. Combine this with cleats and increase traction of the turf, you put yourself at an increased risk for something to happen, especially when we discuss the previous injury that this athlete had the prior year. This, in my opinion, is why the injury seems so fluky. It doesn't negate the fact that we need to address the turf situation, but you never see an ACL injury happening on a straight line. Again, I think some of the friction and the body positioning that the athlete put himself into is a contributing factor of this, but I also believe that the previous injury was also a large factor of this, simply because you're going to have a period of time after the Achilles injury that you're not able to train the quad and hamstrings to the degree that puts you at the preparedness level necessary to play at a high level. Secondary to that, because it's Achilles injury, you're going to see, this is very common for someone coming back from an Achilles injury, is because they can't put weight on their forefoot for such a long period of time, they put weight on their heel. They get very used to putting pressure through their heel, and as a result, you see things like this where they're starting to slow down, crashing down on their heel, and they don't use their whole foot, they don't use their ball of the foot as you naturally would do when you're playing athletics. So now you have habits formed from practicing on a turf all day long where you get used to using poor mechanics because you're allowed to get away with it due to the increased amount of traction. And then secondary, you have the poor mechanics that are influenced by the previous Achilles injury, shifting from more of a whole foot, forefoot strategy to now a more heel dominant strategy. And maybe that also contributing to some of the habitual patterns of heavy heel striking way out in front of the center of mass. So hopefully you can see and tell that there's a lot of contributing factors that are going on here that makes the situation thought to be complex. You need to consider all of these factors. People are going to call this injury a fluke injury, but realistically there's a lot of contributing factors that just led to this perfect storm of an incident. But if we're looking for a factor that is very easy to start weathering this storm of increasing injuries and fluke injuries that happen in sports, it's simply just changing the turf back to grass. And this is another case in point where a complex problem doesn't need a complex solution. It can be very simple that can have a profound impact on the athlete's overall health and well-being.